A soldier came back to his hometown and bought a forgotten farm for just $1. But the instant he stepped through the creaking front door, he froze, breathless. A small blonde girl stood in the middle of the dust-covered room, clutching a faded blanket and calling him Daddy. Yet he had never seen her before in his life. His wife was gone, her grave the only answer she left behind. And this little girl was living alone with nothing but an empty pantry, a blind German shepherd with a white scarf, and a birth certificate bearing his name. What had happened in the years he was gone? And who had been keeping such a heart-shattering secret? The late autumn sun in Willow Creek hung low in the sky, pouring a honey-colored light over rolling hills that had already surrendered their summer green. The air was crisp, the kind that carried the faint bite of an early frost. A dry wind chased fallen leaves along the narrow main street before it spilled into the countryside, rattling the weathered fences and whispering through the skeleton branches of apple trees long past harvest. At the edge of town, the old Hartley farm stood like a forgotten monument, its paint faded to the dull gray of driftwood, windows clouded with dust, and the roof sagging under the weight of years. Daniel Hartman sat behind the wheel of his aging Ford F-150, the engine ticking softly in the cool air after the long drive. At 39, his face bore the kind of lines that no amount of rest could erase, etched deep by sand, wind, and the strain of a decade in combat zones. His hair, once a deep brown, was now salted at the temples, and a faint scar curved along his left cheek, disappearing into a stubble that suggested he had long since stopped caring about appearances. His shoulders were broad, but carried a heaviness that had nothing to do with muscle, the quiet weight of someone who had lost more than he could count. Daniel had left Willow Creek 9 years earlier, a Marine deployed overseas, and returned a man with no home, no wife, and, he believed, no family left at all. The purchase had been strange from the start. $1, the real estate agent had said with a tight smile, just a single signature and the place was his. He hadn't asked too many questions. Sometimes, he'd learned, answers only made the air heavier. What he wanted was solitude, a patch of land where silence would let him breathe. Now, stepping out of the truck, Daniel pulled his jacket closer. The wind slipped under the collar like a cold hand. The porch creaked as he climbed the steps, his boots stirring up a thin cloud of dust. The front door resisted at first, its hinges stiff with rust, but with a groan, it swung inward, letting out a breath of air stale with years of neglect, dust, old wood, and the faint scent of ashes. The interior was dim, lit only by narrow slices of light from the warped window panes. Daniel expected the emptiness of an abandoned house, cold, hollow rooms where nothing stirred. Instead, a muffled sound reached him, the faint scuff of movement, quick and light, somewhere deeper inside. He froze, his hand instinctively brushing the pocket where a combat knife used to rest during patrols. Then he saw her. She stood in the shadowed hallway beyond the living room, a small figure with a shock of untamed blonde hair that caught the dusty light like a halo. Her dress was simple, worn thin at the elbows, the hem frayed, as if she had outgrown it months ago. Bare feet peeked from beneath it, the skin pale and cold-looking against the wooden floor. In her thin arms, she clutched a large German shepherd whose cloudy, unseeing eyes told Daniel instantly the dog was blind. A white scarf, once bright but now weathered from years of wear, was tied gently around the dog's neck, fluttering slightly with every breath the animal took. The girl's eyes were the color of summer wheat, light brown with golden flecks, and they fixed on him with a mix of hesitation and something else, something dangerously close to recognition. "Daddy," she said. Her voice was soft, almost swallowed by the stillness of the house, but the word struck Daniel like a physical blow. He blinked, sure he had misheard. Daddy? The syllables seemed too heavy to belong to him, too foreign after years of believing he had no child. The dog stirred in her arms, lowering to the ground with surprising grace for his size. He stepped forward, not toward Daniel, but in front of the girl, his head low, ears tilted forward. A deep rumble vibrated in his chest, not the savage snarl of a threat, but the steady warning of a guardian prepared to stand his ground. The scarf around his neck lifted in the draft from the doorway. Daniel swallowed. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else. he managed, his voice low. "What's your name, kid?" She hugged the dog closer. "Emily. Emily Rose Hartman." The name landed like a stone in his gut. Hartman. His own last name. His eyes darted between her face and the dog's sightless gaze. "Where's your mom, Emily?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she glanced down at the dog before answering. "Mama's gone." Her voice wavered, the final word barely more than a breath. The wind outside rattled the windows. Daniel took a careful step forward. "How long have you been here?" Emily shrugged, a small, helpless motion. "Since forever. Aunt Monica says I have to stay. Says you left because you didn't want us. But Mama..." Her eyes lifted to his again, shining in the dim light. "Mama told me once you'd come." Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He crouched slowly, his knees creaking in protest, until he was eye level with the girl and the dog, who hadn't moved an inch from his post in front of her. Up close, Daniel could see the milky white haze that clouded Scout's eyes, the faint notches in one ear, the way his fur, though well kept, had thinned with age. He guessed the dog was at least 8 years old, maybe older. "And this," Daniel said softly, "is..." "Scout," Emily answered, a tiny smile flickering and fading in an instant. "He can't see, but he's smarter than anyone. Mama said he used to save people." Scout's tail thumped once against the floor, as if acknowledging the compliment, but his body stayed taut, nose angled toward Daniel, sniffing the air between them. Daniel's gaze wandered past them into the hallway. Against the wall sat a small wooden table, its surface covered with a thin film of dust, except for a clear circle where something had recently rested. On it lay a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. He reached for it, but Emily stepped quickly between him and the table, her small hands pressed to his chest. "You can't," she said firmly. "That's Mama's." The note of protectiveness in her voice was almost too much to bear. Daniel's hand dropped, and for a moment they simply stared at each other, the war-hardened man who thought he'd come home to nothing, and the little girl who had been told her father was gone. Something in his chest shifted, an ache spreading through him in ways he didn't understand. "Emily," he said quietly, "why does your name have my last name?" She tilted her head, frowning as though the question itself was strange. "It's on my paper," she said. Then she turned and walked toward the small table, lifting the folded document and holding it out with both hands. Daniel unfolded it slowly. The paper was a birth certificate. Father, Daniel James Hartman. Mother, Sarah Lynn Hartman. Child, Emily Rose. Hartman. The room swayed around him. His mouth went dry. Sarah. The name struck like a long-buried photograph pulled into the light. Sarah Lynn, tall, willowy, with hair the color of chestnuts and eyes that always seemed to be laughing even when her mouth didn't. She had been the kind of woman who could coax warmth out of strangers with nothing more than a smile, though life had not always been kind to her. Growing up with an absent father and a mother who worked 2 jobs, she had learned to guard her heart fiercely, but with those she loved, she gave everything. Sarah had been his wife, and, apparently, the mother of the daughter he had never known. Daniel's hands trembled as he lowered the certificate. Emily stood there, watching him as if she could see the battle in his head, the disbelief, the sudden fierce surge of protectiveness, the questions he didn't yet know how to ask. Scout gave a low, questioning whine, pressing closer to Emily's side. Daniel took a slow breath. "Emily, I didn't know." The wind outside howled through the eaves, and in that moment, he understood that whatever had happened here in his absence, the truth had been buried as deep as the dust on these floorboards. But it was no longer enough to want solitude. The past had just walked out of the shadows, called him Daddy, and handed him a piece of paper that could change everything. The last rays of daylight slipped through the cracks in the warped shutters, stretching thin golden fingers across the living room floor. Dust swirled lazily in the light, each particle spinning like a fragment of memory caught in suspension. Daniel Hartman stood by the small wooden table where the birth certificate still lay. His eyes lingered on the child-sized handwriting scrawled on the back of an old drawing tacked to the wall. Stick figures holding hands under a crooked sun, one figure missing entirely. Emily sat cross-legged on the faded rug, stroking the fur along Scout's back. The dog, though blind, leaned into her touch, the white scarf brushing lightly against her arm. His ears twitched toward Daniel, then flicked toward the window, as if hearing something only he could detect. Daniel lowered himself onto the sofa, the springs groaning under his weight. "Emily," he began, his voice even, though inside he felt like someone walking across ice that could crack at any second. "Can you tell me about Aunt Monica?" The girl's shoulders stiffened. She didn't look at him. "She's not really my aunt," she said after a pause, her voice quiet, but edged with something that wasn't quite fear, more like caution drilled into habit. "Then who is she?" "She said she was Mama's best friend. She came after Mama got sick. She told me not to talk to people, not to go outside unless she said so. She said if I did, someone might take me away. She said—" Emily's lips pressed together until they were pale. She finally looked up, her eyes steady in a way no 8-year-olds should be. "She said you left because you didn't love us." Daniel felt something tighten behind his ribs. The words were a blade twisting into the hollow of his chest. He glanced at Scout, who had lifted his head, hackles faintly bristling. The dog's cloudy eyes pointed toward the window as if expecting trouble to materialize there. "What else did she say?" Daniel pressed gently. Emily hesitated, then lowered her gaze to Scout. "That Mama was too weak, that she couldn't take care of me without help. She said she was the only one who could keep me safe." Outside, a gust of wind rattled the glass panes. Scout let out a low rumble, deep and continuous. His head angled toward the far corner of the room. Daniel followed the line of his body to the window, where the curtains trembled faintly, not from the wind alone, but as though someone had passed too close outside. He rose and crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling the curtain aside. The yard lay empty, the skeletal branches of an old apple tree scratching against the siding. When he turned back, Emily was watching him with that same guarded expression. "She always watched the windows," Emily murmured. "She didn't like strangers coming near the house." Daniel sank into thought. This wasn't just a controlling woman. It felt like calculated isolation. He decided to explore the rest of the house. In the kitchen, the cupboards were nearly bare, just a few jars of preserves, some dry crackers, and a box of oatmeal. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, though the hearth hadn't been lit in days. At the far end of the hallway, he found a narrow door painted the color of old bone. It stuck for a moment before swinging open to reveal a small storage room. A single shelf lined one wall, cluttered with odds and ends. A cracked lamp base, an empty tin of coffee, and a wooden cabinet with tarnished hinges. The cabinet was locked, but the wood was old and soft. Daniel braced a hand against it, applied steady pressure, and the latch gave with a muted snap. Inside lay a neatly stacked row of envelopes, each yellowed with time. He drew one out and felt his chest tighten at the sight of the handwriting on the front. Slanted, familiar, and achingly personal. Sarah Lynn Hartman. He pulled the top envelope open carefully. The paper inside carried the faint scent of lavender, a fragrance Sarah had always favored. Her words, written in the same looping hand he remembered from letters overseas, spilled out across the page. "Daniel, I've tried to write you so many times, but I don't know if my letters ever reach you. The days are getting shorter, and so is my strength. Monica says she'll help me, but sometimes I think she's hiding things from me. I can't leave the house without her watching. I miss you so much it aches in my bones. Emily asks about you every night before bed. I tell her you're brave, that you're out in the world doing good. Please come back. Please prove me right." Daniel set the letter down slowly, the edges trembling between his fingers. He took another envelope, similar words, but in each, Sarah's tone grew more uncertain, her sentences shorter, her script shakier. By the 4th letter, the ink blurred in places where it had been smeared, as though she had been crying while writing. Behind him, he heard the soft pad of bare feet. Emily stood in the doorway, Scout at her side, the dog's nose twitching toward the open cabinet. "These were Mama's," she said. "I wasn't supposed to touch them. Monica said they were for the trash." Daniel's jaw set. "They're not trash," he said quietly. "They're the truth." Scout moved forward, his head brushing Daniel's knee. The contact was warm, grounding. Daniel realized the dog had positioned himself between the open doorway and the cabinet, as though guarding both the child and the memories they'd uncovered. "Emily," Daniel asked, "when was the last time you saw Monica?" "Before the snow last year. She came for a few days, brought groceries. Then she left and told me to stay inside no matter what. She said if I went out, bad people would come." Daniel nodded slowly, pieces clicking together in his mind. Sarah's illness, the isolation, the letters never sent, Monica's unexplained, control. Something was wrong here, and it ran deeper than grief or miscommunication. He glanced out the small window above the shelf. The light was fading fast, the horizon painted in streaks of crimson and deep violet. In the reflection on the glass, he caught a faint movement, Emily leaning into Scout, the dog's head bowed toward her hand. Daniel closed the cabinet, tucking the letters inside his jacket. He didn't know yet how much danger they were in, but he knew one thing. These letters weren't just pieces of paper. They were Sarah's voice, reaching across the years, warning him. Scout's tail flicked once, then stilled. His ears turned toward the front of the house, and he gave another low growl. Daniel straightened. "It's all right," he murmured to Emily. "We'll be fine." But inside, he wasn't sure if that was a promise or a wish. By the next morning, a thin mist lay over Willow Creek, softening the edges of barns and fence lines, making the old Hartley farm seem even more like a painting left out in the rain. Daniel Hartman stood on the porch with a mug of black coffee, watching the fog curl low along the ground. The letters from Sarah still rested on the table inside, their words looping through his mind like a song he couldn't shut off. A knock startled him. When he opened the door, an elderly woman stood there with a wicker basket balanced on her hip. Margaret Collins had lived in Willow Creek her entire life, and she looked it, her back slightly bent, skin lined with decades of sun and wind, and hair a snowy halo around a face that could be stern or warm depending on her mood. Today her sharp blue eyes studied Daniel as though trying to match him with a memory. She wore a thick knitted cardigan, the kind that looked like it could outlast a storm, and her voice, when she spoke, was steady but softened by age. "You're Daniel," she said without preamble. "Sarah's husband." Daniel nodded, throat tightening. "I am." Margaret stepped inside when he moved aside, her gaze sweeping over the room as if cataloging the changes, or lack of them, since she'd last been here. She set the basket on the table, revealing fresh bread and a jar of preserved peaches. "I came to see Emily, but I also think you should know some things." Emily padded in from the hallway, Scout at her side, the dog's scarf catching the morning light. Margaret's stern expression eased into something softer. She crouched with surprising agility to press a kiss to Emily's hair before straightening again. "When Sarah got sick," Margaret began, settling into a chair, "Monica Blake started showing up every day. Said she was helping, but I didn't like the way she took over. She answered the door for Sarah, handled her mail, even told me when I could and couldn't visit. It was as if she was guarding her." Margaret's jaw tightened. "The last time I saw Sarah, she looked thinner than I'd ever seen her. Could barely keep her eyes open. A week later, Monica told me she'd passed. After that, Monica disappeared. I'd see Emily sometimes, through the window. But when I came up to the porch, she'd be gone before I could knock." Daniel listened, his hands curling into fists against the table's edge. "And no one checked on Emily?" Margaret's eyes clouded. "I tried. She wouldn't answer the door. I'd leave food by the steps, but I couldn't force my way in." She glanced at Scout. Only that dog ever seemed to keep watch. As if on cue, Scout's ears twitched. He rose and padded toward the back door, nose working the air. Daniel noticed the deliberate pace of his steps, the way he seemed to trace a familiar path. Curious, he followed. The yard was still damp from the morning dew, and Scout's paws left dark prints in the grass. He moved with the certainty of a creature who knew every inch of this land. Blindness be damned. Emily trailed behind, pulling her sweater tighter. "He's going to the garden," she said. "He does that sometimes." The garden was a ragged patch of ground bordered by what had once been a white picket fence, now leaning in several directions. In one corner, near the skeletal remains of an apple tree, Scout stopped. His nose dipped to the earth, tail held stiff. Then, with sudden urgency, he began to paw at the ground. Daniel knelt beside him. The soil here was looser, darker. Scout worked in short, determined bursts until the edge of something wooden peeked through the dirt. Daniel brushed away the rest by hand, revealing a small, weathered box, its hinges mottled with rust. He lifted it out carefully. Emily crouched beside him, her eyes wide. "I didn't know that was there." Back inside, Daniel set the box on the table. The latch was stiff, but gave way under steady pressure. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded cloth, was a stack of photographs and a small brass key. The top photo froze him in place. Sarah, in the hospital gown of a maternity ward, cradled a newborn swaddled in a blanket. Her hair was pulled back, her face pale but glowing with the unmistakable light of new motherhood. And on the back, in Sarah's familiar hand, were the words, "For Daniel, if you come home." Beneath it were more photos. Sarah smiling in the backyard with a toddler Emily. Scout, younger, with sharp eyes and a proud stance, sitting at Sarah's feet. Emily laughing in a pile of autumn leaves, her arms thrown around the dog's neck. Daniel picked up the brass key. It was small, ornate, the kind meant for an old-style lock. He turned it over in his palm, recognizing the etched initials on one side. S.H. Sarah Hartman. Margaret leaned forward, frowning. "That looks like the kind of key the town offices use for their older storage vaults. If Sarah had one..." Daniel didn't wait to finish the thought. "Then there's something there she wanted to keep safe." He made the decision then and there. Within the hour, he was at Willow Creek's town hall, a squat brick building with ivy creeping up its sides. The front desk was manned by Frank Dalton, a wiry man in his 50s with thinning hair and a pair of glasses perpetually sliding down his nose. Frank had been the municipal clerk for over 20 years, his manner efficient, but tinged with the small-town habit of knowing more than he said. "Daniel Hartman," Frank said after Daniel introduced himself. "Well, I'll be damned. Haven't heard that name since Sarah came in about the will." Daniel's pulse quickened. "You remember that?" Frank's eyes narrowed. "I remember it because it was strange. She looked unwell, and Monica Blake was glued to her side. Sarah had a draft will with your name on it, but when the final version came back, your name was gone. Crossed. Out. No explanation. Monica handled the paperwork after that." "Do you still have the draft?" Daniel asked. Frank tapped the brass key Daniel had set on the counter. "If that's what I think it is, it'll open one of the old file vaults in the basement." Minutes later, they were in a narrow, dim corridor lined with metal cabinets. The lock clicked open under the key, and Frank pulled out a slim folder. Inside was the original draft, Sarah's handwriting clear, leaving her assets to Emily, with Daniel named as guardian. Across his name, in heavy inks, a single line struck through, leaving a blank space. Daniel stared at it, the image of Sarah's hospital photo burning in his mind. Whatever had happened to his wife's wishes, Monica had been there for all of it, and now he had proof that someone had deliberately erased him from his daughter's life. The morning after Daniel's trip to the town hall was cold enough to leave frost along the edges of the old porch boards. The sun struggled through a gauze of pale clouds, giving the air a sharp, metallic taste. Daniel had risen early, the image of Sarah's crossed-out name in the will still gnawing at him. Emily was inside, working on a puzzle at the kitchen table. Scout curled protectively at her feet, his white scarf bright against his dark fur. The crunch of tires on gravel broke the stillness. Daniel stepped to the edge of the porch just as a sleek black Lexus eased up to the gate, a car that looked foreign against the backdrop of weathered barns and wild grass. The driver's door opened, and Monica Blake stepped out. She was in her late 30s, tall and willowy, with perfectly arranged auburn hair that shimmered under the weak sunlight. Her face had a porcelain quality, flawless skin, sharp cheekbones, but her eyes, a calculating shade of green, seemed to measure every detail in their path. She wore a fitted charcoal coat, matching heels that sank slightly into the soft earth, and a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Daniel!" she called, her voice warm enough to be mistaken for sincerity by anyone who didn't know better. "I heard you were back." Daniel didn't move from the porch. "How'd you hear?" Monica's smile tilted. Small towns have big mouths. She started toward the steps, the click of her heels deliberate, confident. "I wanted to see Emily, and to talk." As soon as she reached the bottom step, Scout appeared in the doorway behind Daniel, his cloudy eyes fixed on the sound of her voice. his head lowering. A deep growl rolled from his chest, and he stepped forward until he stood between Monica and the open door. The white scarf fluttered slightly in the wind, but his stance was solid, immovable. Monica stopped, her gaze flicking briefly to the dog. "Still got that mud, I see," she said lightly, though her lips tightened. "He was always territorial." "Protective," Daniel corrected. She smoothed her coat, ignoring the correction. "I think it's time we discuss what's best for Emily. She needs stability, a proper home. I've looked after her before. You can't deny that." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Looked after her? You left her alone in a house for months at a time, an 8-year-old. That's not care, Monica. That's abandonment." Her smile faltered, but only for a heartbeat. "That's a harsh word. I had obligations, but I kept the house. I brought food. You isolated her," Daniel cut in. "Told her I'd left because I didn't love her. You controlled who saw her, even after Sarah died." At the mention of Sarah, Monica's eyes hardened, the green turning cold. "Sarah was too trusting," she said softly, almost to herself. "She believed in people she shouldn't have." Before Daniel could respond, Emily appeared, in the doorway beside Scout. Monica's face shifted instantly, her tone sweet as honey. "Emily, darling, come here. I've missed you so much." Scout's growl deepened, his body stiff as a board. Emily stayed where she was, her small hand gripping the doorframe. "I'm fine here," she said quietly. Monica's smile froze, then thinned. She looked back to Daniel. "You think you can just walk back into her life after all these years? I have every right to petition for custody, and I will. You've been gone, Daniel, and I doubt the court will look kindly on a man with no steady income, a history of combat, and no permanent residence until now." Daniel stepped down one stair, closing the space between them by just enough to make his words sharp. "Try it, and I'll make sure every word Sarah ever wrote about you sees the light of day." Something flickered in Monica's eyes, fear, quickly buried under a veneer of control. She stepped back, her voice smooth again. "We'll see." She turned and walked back to her car, her heels clicking against the gravel. As she opened the door, she looked over her shoulder, her expression cool and sharp as glass. "You have no idea what I can do." The engine purred to life, and the Lexus rolled away, disappearing down the road. The rest of the morning passed in uneasy quiet. Emily stuck close to Scout, who seemed even more alert than usual, his ears swiveling at every sound. Around midday, Daniel decided to check the old rainwater cistern behind the barn, an open, moss-covered pit that had worried him since he'd first seen it. Emily trailed behind, Scout at her side. The ground near the cistern was slick with damp moss, and before Daniel could warn her, Emily's foot slipped. The edge crumbled under her weight, and she pitched forward with a gasp. Scout lunged, jaws catching the back of her sweater. With a sharp, almost desperate pull, he dragged her back from the crumbling edge, his claws scrabbling against the dirt. Daniel was there a heartbeat later, hauling her into his arms. "You're okay," he said, holding her tight. His eyes cut to the ground where she'd slipped and froze. There was a fresh scuff in the dirt, as though someone had kicked away at the moss to loosen it. The marks were too clean to be natural wear. Daniel's stomach turned cold. The cistern had been dangerous before, but now, this felt deliberate. His mind flashed back to Monica's visit, the way she'd looked past him toward the back of the property when she'd arrived. Scout stayed pressed against Emily, his blind eyes scanning the open air, as if he could still sense the shape of the threat. That night, as Emily drifted to sleep with Scout curled at her side, Daniel stood at the window, watching the dark outline of the barn. Monica's parting words echoed in his head. He didn't know exactly what she was capable of, but he was starting to get an idea. The county courthouse in Willow Creek loomed against a pale winter sky, its stone facade weathered by decades but still carrying the air of authority. Inside, the corridors smelled faintly of old paper and varnished wood. Daniel Hartman sat at the plaintiff's table in a dark suit that felt strange on him, too stiff after years and fatigues. His posture was upright, shoulders squared, but his hands were tight around the edge of the table. Beside him sat Jack Reynolds, his attorney, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with sharp eyes and a voice trained to slice through a room. Jack's neatly trimmed beard and pressed navy suit gave him the air of someone who planned every move 3 steps ahead. On the other side of the aisle, Monica Blake made her entrance as if the courtroom were her stage. She was in her late 30s, tall and poised, her honey blonde hair swept into a sleek bun. Her fitted charcoal dress and pearl earrings gave her an aura of refined control, but there was something in her expression, tight around the mouth, a flicker in the eyes, that betrayed the tension beneath the polish. She sat beside her lawyer, a wiry man named Thomas Hale, whose tailored pinstripe suit and habit of constantly adjusting his cufflinks marked him as someone who valued appearances as much as arguments. At the rear of the room, Emily sat between Daniel and Jack, wearing a pale blue dress Margaret had pressed for her that morning. Her blonde hair was brushed into loose waves, but the way her hands twisted in her lap betrayed her nerves. Beside her, on the polished oak floor, Scout lay perfectly still. The old German shepherd's white scarf stood out starkly against his dark coat, his head resting on his front paws. His milky eyes didn't move, but his ears tracked every sound. The hush that settled over the room when people noticed him was palpable. Judge Harold Ellison entered, a tall man with a salt and pepper beard and an expression that could quiet a crowd. He had a reputation for fairness, but also for cutting through sentiment to get to facts. "We're here to determine the rightful guardianship of Emily Rose Hartman and the validity of the last will and testament of Sarah Lynn Hartman," he began. Jack rose first. "Your Honor, my client returned from military service to find his daughter living alone, her existence hidden from him for years. We submit as evidence Sarah Hartman's personal journal, the original draft of her will, naming Daniel Hartman as guardian, Emily's birth certificate, and corroborating witness statements." He placed each item carefully on the clerk's desk. The journal was worn, its cover creased, the ink faded in places. "These entries," Jack said, "detail Sarah's illness, Monica Blake's increasing control over her life, and her explicit wish that Daniel raise Emily if she passed away." He handed the book to the judge. Monica's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, the journal is subjective. It cannot prove my client acted with malice. Sarah was ill and still coherent enough to write her wishes clearly," Jack cut in. The birth certificate came next, listing Daniel as Emily's father. Jack followed with testimony from Margaret Collins, who took the stand in her knitted cardigan, her voice firm, as she described Monica turning visitors away and isolating Sarah. Frank Dalton confirmed the alteration of the will, describing the moment Sarah's name shook as she signed and Daniel's was crossed out. When it was Emily's turn, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. She looked at the judge, then at Daniel, and finally down at Scout, who had lifted his head as if sensing her unease. "I just want to be with my daddy and Scout," she said softly, her voice carrying in the silence. "Mama said he was brave, and I waited for him. I don't want to go anywhere else." For a moment, even Monica's polished facade faltered. Judge Ellison's gaze shifted to Monica. "Mrs. Blake, do you wish to respond?" Monica stood, her tone smooth, but with a tremor underneath. "I cared for Sarah when no one else would. I provided for Emily." "You left her alone," Daniel's voice cut in, steady but low. The judge's gavel tapped once for order. Jack's final words sealed the tone of the room. "This is not only about property or guardianship, Your Honor. It's about a mother's last wishes, a father's right, and a child's safety." When Judge Ellison returned with his decision, the entire courtroom leaned forward. "The court finds the will naming Monica Blake sole beneficiary invalid, given credible evidence of alteration. All assets of Sarah Lynn Hartman will be transferred to her daughter, Emily Rose Hartman. Full and permanent guardianship is granted to her biological father, Daniel Hartman. The matter of alleged forgery and child abandonment by Monica Blake will be referred for criminal investigation." Daniel exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Emily turned to him, and he gathered her into his arms. Scout, sensing the shift, thumped his tail once against the floor. 2 weeks later, the Hartley farm looked different. The yard had been cleared, the fence repaired, and in the back field, Daniel and Emily planted a row of young apple trees. The ground was cold beneath their boots, but the air was bright with the promise of spring. Beside them, Scout lay in the grass, the white scarf stirring in the breeze, his ears tilted toward the sound of their laughter. At the far corner, near the old apple tree where Scout had once led Daniel to Sarah's keepsakes, they planted one tree especially for her. Daniel set the sapling in place while Emily held it steady. "For Mama," she whispered. As they patted the soil back into place, Daniel rested a hand on Emily's shoulder. "We're home now," he said, and for the first time in years, he meant it. Sometimes God's miracles are not in the thunder or the fire, but in the quiet return of what was lost. Daniel's journey to find Emily was not just a father reclaiming his child, but a testimony that truth, when guided by faith, will always find the light. Scout, though blind, saw with a heart that never wavered, reminding us that God often sends protectors in unexpected forms. In our everyday lives, we may face those who twist the truth, close doors, or try to take what's precious. But, like Daniel, we can stand firm, trusting that God's timing is perfect and His justice is sure. If this story has touched your heart, share it so others may find hope. Leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe for more stories of love and redemption, and join us in praying for all fathers, mothers, and children still waiting to be reunited. If you believe that God still works in quiet, unseen ways to bring families back together, write Amen in the comments. May the Lord bless and keep every viewer who hears this story today.